so that the system displays your video.
2, 1. The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairwoman Bass, for convening today's very important hearing on a very disturbing topic, the backsliding we have seen throughout Sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to democracy and governance. And I thank you for the courtesy of letting me to go first. I am also the ranking member on the China Commission, and we have a hearing at 10 o'clock on Tibet, and I have an opening comments there I need to make, so I'm going to go and come back. So I do thank you for that courtesy. It's very kind of you. Madam Chair, according to the metrics put out by the Economist Intelligence Unit, earlier this year, democracy in Sub-Saharan Africa has been on the retreat, declining between 2018 and 2019, when its democracy index recorded its lowest total since 2010. With postponements of elections in 2020 attributed to COVID-19 and subsequent lockdowns serving sometimes as a pretext for stifling dissent, I fear that 2020 may see an even greater decrease in democracy on the continent. Today's hearing is also timely, as elections are approaching next month in Tanzania and the Ivory Coast, both countries which appear to be on a downward trajectory in terms of governance and respect for civil and political rights. And I want to note that Chairwoman Bass has introduced legislation with respect to Tanzania, and I'm very proud to be a co-sponsor of it, and I thank her for that leadership. We also see the role of outside actors facilitating a downward race to the bottom, in particular, China, which seeks to export its bad governance model throughout Africa, but also the Gulf states, Turkey, and even African countries such as Rwanda, which has had a sustained disruptive impact on its neighbors for many years, particularly in the DRC. I expect we will hear about the U.S., what the U.S. is doing to promote democracy and good governance throughout Africa, and we have as one of our witnesses, our distinguished witnesses, Dr. Chris Fomuno. Thank you for your work at NDI. And along with its sister organization, the IRI, they've dedicated much of their work to promotion of democracy in Sub-Saharan Africa. I also hope that we will take a closer look at our missteps as well. For example, it was quite obvious to outside observers in the DRC that the declared winner of the latest presidential election held in late 2018, Felix Tshisekedi, received less votes than Martin Fayolo because of a corrupt bargain between the outgoing strawman Joseph Kabila. Tshisekedi, the Constitutional Court, packed by Kabila, declared him to be the winner. What happened next was troubling, as our State Department issued a statement that said, and I quote, "The United States welcomes the Congolese Constitutional Court certification of Felix Tshisekedi as the next president of the DRC, which was apparently driven by a handful of diplomats, including our ambassador." I believe this sent a terrible message with ramifications not only within the DRC, but beyond as well. For example, elections in Nigeria were first postponed by sitting President Buhari and marred by irregularities in advance of the election day, including arson attacks on the Independent National Electoral Commission offices in opposition strongholds, and Buhari's removal of Supreme Court Justice Walter Onogun. Nonetheless, there has also been progress, too, and we should note that. Namibia is developing towards a stable democracy. During the last elections in Namibia, we saw an incumbent president win re-election with a reduced vote and a robust opposition winning enough votes to deny the ruling party, SWAPO, its supermajority in the legislature. Botswana is another example of a country which is developing good democratic habits. While there's room for improvement in both countries, the overall trajectory is positive. We also welcome, with guarded optimism, developments in Sudan following the ouster of longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. Yet at the same time, we need to temper our appraisal, given the continued role of people such as Hamedi and Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the real powers behind the throne. Both have been implicated in past atrocities in Darfur, and both must ultimately be held to account for that. Before Sudan is delisted as a state sponsor of terrorism, I also believe there must be justice for all victims of its past bad acts, including the victims of 9/11, many of whom live in my home state of New Jersey and in my district. Ethiopia has made fitful progress since Prime Minister Abiy assumed power. There was initial euphoria as he released political prisoners in the free media. When Chairwoman Bass and I met with him in August of 2018 in Addis, he was riding a wave of optimism. Since then, however, ethnic and religious tensions have roiled Ethiopia with targeted attacks against ethnic and religious minorities in certain states. Elections have been postponed on account of COVID crisis, and the government response to violence has been mixed. Arrests of political opponents, some of whom have themselves fomented violence, is worrisome. My personal view is that the Prime Minister is trying to advance a pan-Ethiopian vision which transcends ethnicity and religion, but he's also facing very strong headwinds. Respect for democracy also demands that opposition figures behave responsibly as well, in addition to the government, which yields this levers of power. Finally, I want to note that in my position as past chairman and now current ranking member, I have met many African leaders, as has our distinguished chairwoman, including some with whom I took to task for offenses against democracy, including Bashir, when I met with him in 2005 in Khartoum, and former President Meles. But there are others who have stood out in a very positive way, including the former President of Benin, whom I met at the General Assembly 1 year ago, and with whom we had a very, very good exchange. Unfortunately, his successor, President Patrice Talon, has not preserved the gift that he was given. He has cracked down on free speech, imposed restriction on political organizing, shot demonstrators, and even detained for nearly 2 months his predecessor, who subsequently had to flee the country. I grieve for Benin and its people, and as I do, as we all do, for many in Africa who have not realized the dream of democracy to which they are entitled. I thank the chairwoman and yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Smith. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with H.R. 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. Thank you for attending today's hearing on democratic backsliding in sub-Saharan Africa, which we believe is timely as other parts of the world, including here, suffer similar challenges. I want to thank our distinguished witnesses today who will provide deeper insight into the dynamics contributing to the erosion of democracy in sub-Saharan Africa and the impact this seemingly global trend will have on democratic governance, economic growth, and improved access to health and education resources. We're here today because several countries across the African continent are retreating from core democratic principles, which we refer to as democratic backsliding. Democratic backsliding includes, but is not limited to, the degradation of free and fair elections, infringement on freedom of speech, impairment of political opposition to challenge the government or hold it accountable, the weakening of the rule of law, such as limiting the autonomy of the judiciary, and the manufacturing or overemphasizing of a national security threat that allows the government to malign critics. These actions, singularly or collectively, lead to state-organized debilitation or elimination of political institutions that can look like actions taken to uphold or strengthen democracy. Flawed elections remain an issue in most of Africa, with leaders manipulating laws, freedoms, and elections to retain power. Most concerning is the situation in Tanzania, which I recently addressed in House Resolution 1120, where current leadership is repressing the opposition and basic freedoms of expression and assembly in a blatant attempt to retain power. We see similar patterns in Cote d'Ivoire as the executive branch legalizes the deviation in democratic institutions to codify non-democratic actions. We have similar concerns about Guinea and are going to be very watchful of upcoming elections there and in Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Chad, Gabon, Ghana, Niger, and Somalia. The actions of these governments to suppress freedoms of expression, including social media, to exclude opposition participation in the electoral process, and to use police and military resources against protesters undermine democracy and jeopardize the rights and very lives of their citizens. There are many sub-Saharan countries of concerns, and I look forward to hearing which countries we should monitor closely and the witnesses' recommendations for how we can support them. What concerns me most is that democratic backsliding is not limited to Africa, and we seem to be in a place of retreat from democracy that I only hope is an anomaly. In Europe, we see the egregious behavior of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who claimed success in a disputed August 9th election and sought support from extranational resources such as Russia to justify his claim to power. Thousands of Belarusians openly protested against the election results for more than 50 days, suffering multiple incidents of police brutality. This democratic backsliding comes approximately 1 year after the U.S. and Belarus agreed to exchange ambassadors after a 15-year pause as a result of significant democratic progress of the Belarusian government. Other European countries experiencing democratic backsliding include Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Serbia, and Turkey, to which we must continue to lend our support and protect the dignity and rights of their citizens. In Asia and Latin America, we have to be extremely vigilant to help strengthen democracy in some of the largest and most populous countries in the world, such as Brazil, India, the Philippines, and Thailand. In Brazil, President Bolsonaro is challenging the autonomy of the judiciary and Congress to investigate the excessive presence of the military in civil public services. President Duterte of the Philippines is accused of lawfare or weaponizing the law to deter or defeat freedoms, personalities, and establishments that promote human rights, press freedoms, and the rule of law, while also cracking down on individual freedoms. These countries have experienced erosion in democratic institutions and human rights, exemplified by the imposition of tighter state control over multiple political institutions that result in more authoritarian forms of government and increased human suffering. I have only mentioned a few, but there are other nations suffering from democratic backsliding or democratic failure. In these countries, human suffering and poverty correlate directly to authoritarianism and corruption. Now, finally, in our own country, the United States is witnessing an erosion of democracy as various institutions are misused to solidify power. The threat of a non-peaceful transition of power and other electoral irregularities, such as delegitimizing the use of mail-in ballots during a global pandemic, the use of rhetoric to instill fear and disunity among the citizenry, threatening to send people to the polls to intimidate voters, while also expediting the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice to support the incumbent in case of a contested election. These are only a few examples of democratic backsliding in the United States. And as the global champion for democracy, the U.S. can't allow these actions to continue or prevail. It is of paramount importance that the United States set the highest example and use our democratic institutions such as the Constitution, freedom of expression, assembly and association, and fair and free elections to preserve and advance democratic leadership around the world. The world is watching us, and we can, if we're not careful, conveniently become an excuse for others backsliding. Although backsliding is not new, we notice a particular pattern of change also caused by COVID-19 global pandemic that has led to subtle, incremental democratic erosion as some sitting leaders use safety measures to prevent the spread of the virus, to debilitate freedom of expression and infringe upon human rights. Tanzania offers a stark example of this behavior by denying the existence of COVID-19 in the country and suppression of information related to the pandemic that places citizens' health at risk and violates citizens' freedom of speech and right of access to information. We also have been guilty of mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic through misinformation, politicizing public health guidance, and the failure to develop a national strategy and participate in international efforts to eradicate the disease. Most alarming is the president's attempt to discredit the election process by threatening not to accept defeat and alleging election fraud should he lose, and by challenging the legality of mail-in ballots, which are extremely important during a global pandemic that requires sheltering in place. The impacts of global democratic backsliding are severe and threaten the very foundation of human advancement, as we have seen its extreme forms in Mali, Hungary, the Philippines, and Venezuela. Clearly, our work is cut out for us, but we can be hopeful in the fact that democracy is an enduring institution that has survived for centuries. According to the International Report on the Global State of Democracy, addressing the ills and reviving the promise, democracy is a resilient form of government and remains in strong demand around the world. 81 of the 97 democracies have enjoyed uninterrupted democratic status since their democratic transitions. The report further notes democratic nations enjoy higher level of gender equality and human development and lower levels of corruption, ideals for which we must ceaselessly strive to be enjoyed by all peoples of the world. I look forward to hearing the views, perspectives, and recommendations of the panel of witnesses we have here today. Without objection, Mr. Chairman is coming? Okay, all right. Let me move to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Chris Fomuno, is the Senior Associate for Africa and Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute. He has led international election observation missions and supervised democracy support programs in various African countries. He is an adjunct faculty at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and a former adjunct professor of African politics and government at Georgetown University. Our second witness is Dr. Dorina Biko, is a research staff member with the Africa program at the Institute for Defense Analysis. Previously, she was an associate professor of conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. She is the editor of Voting in Fear, Electoral Violence in Sub-Saharan Africa. Her areas of expertise include Africa's political development, conflict resolution and peace building, peace agreements, electoral violence, and institutional reform. Dr. Jon Temin is the director of the Africa program at the Freedom House. From 2014 to 2017, he was a member of the U.S. Department of State policy planning staff, providing strategic guidance and long-term thinking to the Secretary of State. He also served as director of the U.S. Institute of Peace Africa program, leading the Institute's effort to help end conflicts and prevent new violence. Our final witness who will be online is Joshua Meservey, is the Senior Policy Analyst for Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation. He studies African geopolitics and counterterrorism. He is a returned Peace Corps volunteer who served in Zambia before joining a refugee settlement organization based out of Nairobi, Kenya. I'd like to welcome Dr. Fomunyoh. I think your microphone is not on. Is the light on?
Yep.
Okay.
Chairman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, on behalf of the National Democratic Institute, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss democratic backsliding in Sub-Saharan Africa and issues of institutional fragility, freedoms, and human rights. NDI has over 3 decades of technical assistance to and support for democratic institutions and processes in Africa, and currently runs active programs in 20 countries. On a personal note, I've served with the Institute for over 25 years, and remember NDI's first initiative in Africa, a conference on multipartyism in Senegal, held in Dakar, Senegal in 1985. A few years ago, after that Senegal conference on multipartyism, the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the anti-apartheid hero, Nelson Mandela, regained his freedom in South Africa. And that began a cascade of events in the late 1980s and early 1990s that jump-started a wave of democratization across the entire continent. By Freedom House's ratings, Africa then went from 2/3 of the countries classified as not free, and only 2 countries, Botswana and Mauritius, free in 1989, to 2/3 of all African countries classified as either free or partly free by 2009. Unfortunately, regrettably, by 2019, democratic trends reversed, and there are now fewer democracies in Africa than was the case 20 years ago. Notably, West Africa, previously commended as a trailblazer region, has seen serious backsliding as Mali experienced a military coup and major controversies have arisen about candidacies of incumbent presidents in Guinea-Conakry and Cote d'Ivoire. The Central Africa region remains stuck, with the highest concentration of autocratic regimes, with the 3 longest-serving presidents in the world in that sub-region, notably Equatorial Guinea, 41 years, Cameroon, 38 years, and Congo-Brazzaville, 38 years. In Southern and East Africa, continued persecution of political opposition and civil society activists in Zimbabwe, and similar worrying signs or patterns in Tanzania since 2016, seriously diminished citizen participation in politics and governance, and also stymied prospects for much-needed reforms. The COVID-19 pandemic has not helped, as it has slowed or impeded election preparations and generated fears that in some countries, with national elections scheduled to take place before the end of the year, incumbents would use emergency powers to limit freedoms of expression and assembly and further shrink political space. In my written testimony, I go into much more detail about the domestic or internal ingredients of backsliding, as well as the external vectors that contribute to backsliding. I also list in more detail the linkage that I see between constitutionalism, or the lack of respect for constitutional term limits, and authoritarianism by taking a more detailed look at the specific case of Cameroon, where an incumbent president forced through a constitutional amendment in 2018 so that even now, at age 87, and after 38 years in office, he could continue to run for president for the rest of his life. Despite this, sorry, Madam Chair, building a firewall against democratic backsliding in Africa requires a combined effort amongst Africans and democracy advocates, practitioners, and champions worldwide. Below are a few recommendations that could contribute to that collective endeavor. The U.S. should revamp its Africa policy with a view to consolidating investments made over the past 3 decades in building democratic institutions, and especially targeting that assistance towards the generation that is 35 years or younger, that I term the democratization wave generation, which constitutes 75% of Africa's population. The international community at large should amplify public diplomacy on measures that strengthen democracy and provide avenues within the United Nations system, including the United Nations Security Council, to discuss issues that pertain to gross human rights violations and atrocities on the African continent that shock the world and humanity's conscience. Africans themselves should also intensify building synergistic national and regional networks of democracy advocates and champions to foster peer-to-peer review, support, and encouragement.
Thank you. You'll have a little more time during the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Dr. Biko?
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Bass and Ranking Member Smith and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify on democratic backsliding in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses, as you said.
You might want to pull the mic closer. It's hard to understand you.
My remarks do not represent IDA or any of its government sponsors. My remarks and views are my own, and my testimony will focus on elections and political transition. So today, all countries in Africa except Eritrea hold elections. Africa's experience has been mixed. While there have been notable strides and important innovations, worrisome trends undermine Africa's governance and security. Many hoped that elections would result in regular, peaceful, predictable changes in government, such as reducing the number of coups, and they have, but coups still occur, even in the context of the predictability of a democratic government. Mali's 2012 coup took place even though there was a regularly scheduled election just 1 month away. And the coup in August of this year took place despite the fact that in 2018, there's a presidential election, and last year there were legislative elections. Many hoped that elections would also end authoritarianism by offering opportunities for changes in government. And while 21 countries on the continent have respected their constitutionally mandated 2-term limit, 14 countries have modified or eliminated the term limit, and 8 countries have never adopted them. In Africa today, there are 10 leaders that have served for 20 years or more, and my colleague Chris Fomuno highlighted a number of them. An important aspect is understanding how African citizens themselves rate the quality of their country's elections. And here we turn to Afrobarometer, which is an independent Pan-African research institution. And their surveys indicate that 40% of Africa's citizens rated their countries as having organized completely free and fair elections, so less than half. And this average has held steady for over 2 decades, or for the last 2 decades. Citizens also communicate by turning out to vote. And research that I've done with Stephanie Burchard showed that reduced voter turnout is one of the many side effects of pre-election violence, and we saw that in Kenya. Low voter turnout also reflects low political engagement, and we can look to Mali on this as well. Sustained low voter turnout, between 30 and 40%, has often been cited as an indication of public disengagement, disdain for corruption, and mistrust of the country's democratic institutions, which some analysts feel also facilitated the acceptance of a coup. Electoral violence is an important indicator of democratic backsliding, and some highlights from research tell us that approximately 65% of Africa's elections have experienced violence. Most of that violence has been in the form of verbal harassment, discouraging political aspirants, vandalizing election materials, impeding the media. We also know that 95% of electoral violence is before the election. Post-election violence, while it's less frequent, is actually much deadlier, and Africa's worst incidents of electoral violence have occurred afterwards. There are some encouraging signs that I'd like to point out, however. One, Kenyan civil society has pioneered electronic platforms where citizens can record incidents of fraud and harassment, and that's been replicated many places on the continent. There are election situation rooms where information is conveyed to a central location, and steps are taken to mitigate tension. Parallel vote tabulation is also widely practiced as a check on official results, and other countries, like Ghana, have developed national peace infrastructure to play an active role in creating a peaceful environment. Judiciaries are also playing an important role in leveling the playing field, but they must be credible and independent. I'd like to just close with 3 recommendations. One is to focus on the pre-election environment by identifying hotspots of violence and developing mechanisms to reduce tension. 2 is to strengthen electoral dispute adjudication, supporting viable and trusted avenues for addressing electoral grievances, whether through the courts, negotiations, or other mechanisms. And then finally, to provide support to independent civil society organizations to enhance their capacity to prevent electoral violence and enhance the quality and credibility of elections. So I'll close with that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Temin?
Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to testify before you today. I ask that my full written testimony be admitted to the record. I will start by highlighting several trends we at Freedom House observed in Sub-Saharan Africa in the most recent version of our Freedom in the World report. First, we are seeing lots of volatility in the state of freedoms and democracy. Of the 12 largest score declines globally in our recent report, 7 are in Sub-Saharan Africa. But of the 8 largest improvements, 6 are in the region. Second, West Africa, previously considered the democratic leader among Africa's subregions, is of particular concern. Of those 7 large score declines, 5 are from countries in West Africa. Third, freedom and democratic governance is enjoyed by far too few Africans. Only 9% of people in Sub-Saharan Africa live in countries that Freedom House categorizes as free. Citizens bear the brunt of democratic backsliding. They are attacked when they peacefully protest in opposition to the government, as in Guinea and Cameroon. They are unable to use the internet when the government restricts access, as in Ethiopia and Chad. Civil society groups face excessive limitations on their activity, as in Tanzania and Burundi. And journalists are threatened and detained, as in Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Governments are developing new methods to limit citizen activity, such as requiring bloggers to meet stringent registration requirements, as in Uganda, and using COVID-19 as a pretext for closing political and civic space. To which I'll add that Freedom House strongly endorses H.R. 6986, the Protecting Human Rights During Pandemic Act, which is currently under consideration. In the interest of time, I will focus the rest of my remarks on recommendations. My first recommendation concerns American messaging. While that messaging is often strongly supportive of democracy, it is inconsistent. This is inevitable, as competing American interests will always lead to modulated messaging based on the context. But we need to strive for greater consistency across countries and regions in how we speak about democracy. To cite one example, the United States and much of the rest of the world has rightly criticized the undemocratic change of power in Mali, a textbook example of a coup. But when leaders in Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, and in Rwanda, Chad, Uganda, and elsewhere before them, sought to change the rules of the game to extend their time in office, amounting to an undemocratic extension of their tenure, the American voice has been muted. This contradiction does not go unnoticed among Africans and contributes to a sense that the United States places security interests above democratic concerns and pulls punches when issues involve our perceived allies. Second, and building on my first recommendation, the United States should consider changes to term and age limits that allow incumbent leaders to extend their time in office as, essentially, a coup against the Constitution and respond accordingly. These moves by leaders who have already served 2 terms are an usurpation of power that deny the country and its citizens the many benefits of leadership rotation. Most important, they are broadly unpopular with citizens. Polling by Afrobarometer consistently demonstrates that approximately 3/4 of Africans favor 2-term limits for their leaders. Legislation requires that when a military overthrows a duly elected government, many forms of assistance to that country are suspended. As a matter of policy, the United States should adopt a similar approach when a leader changes the rules to benefit himself or herself. That move should trigger an automatic, across-the-board review of all assistance to the country, and elements of that assistance that benefit the executive and upper echelons of government should be suspended. Congress should consider institutionalizing this policy through legislation. That way, leaders will know that if they choose to change the rules to benefit themselves, they will automatically face consequences. This policy should apply globally, not just to Africa. Third, countries where citizens are bravely seeking to move past decades of authoritarianism deserve rapid and substantial support from the United States. Opportunities to buttress successful citizen-led movements for democracy are rare. In Sudan, the long overdue process of removing the country from the list of state sponsors of terrorism may soon conclude, but that is not enough. The United States needs to support the civilian component of Sudan's transitional government at every step of the long road toward democracy and do all that it can to revive Sudan's economy. In Ethiopia, there are deeply concerning signs that the government is reaching for tools of repression that many hoped were relegated to history. Nonetheless, Ethiopia remains on a tentative path to democratic elections that can be transformative. In this context, the decision by the United States to withhold development assistance from Ethiopia in a quixotic and counterproductive effort to influence Ethiopia's negotiating position concerning the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is bad policy that should be reversed. Now is not the time to curtail support to Ethiopia's more than 100 million citizens and inhibit their efforts to democratize. Similar to Sudan and Ethiopia, nascent democratic transitions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Gambia, and Angola also call for strong U.S. support. Permit me to conclude with a broader observation. The ability of the United States to advance democracy around the world, including in Africa, is directly tied to the strength of our democracy at home. The United States remains broadly popular in the eyes of Africans, but many of them are closely watching the strength of our institutions and how we manage our differences through peaceful, democratic processes. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Our final witness is Mr. Joshua Meservey, and he is online.
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you on this important topic. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing the official position of the Heritage Foundation. I've been asked to focus my remarks on the role that foreign powers may play in the democratic backsliding happening in parts of Africa. The Chinese government is the staunchest anti-democratic actor in Africa. The antipathy to democratic values is inherent to the Chinese Communist Party's, or CCP's, ideology, which believes in the utter primacy of the party over all facets of life. China's communist leadership believes that only complete fidelity to its ideology can help it achieve its goals. Democracy, with its devolution of power to citizens, is a horrifying concept to the CCP. It is an existential threat, in fact. It is unsurprising that the CCP crushes liberty at home and battles it overseas. This manifests with varying levels of intensity and obviousness across the African continent. And while I believe the Chinese government is deliberately trying to undermine African democracy, some of its other actions can have that same effect, even if it is not by design. Some of the ways the Chinese government threatens democracy are as follows. First, it openly denigrates democracy, claiming that it is a Trojan horse of the West to enable meddling in African affairs. Beijing blames multi-party democracy for bringing chaos and poverty to Africa and spreads the idea that economic rights trump fundamental individual rights that form the core of any successful democracy. Second, since President Xi Jinping's ascension, Beijing increasingly offers its own model of development, which is some economic freedom with repressive governance, as a solution for African nations. Third, Beijing's supposed no-strings-attached aid policy allows regimes to use that aid to fuel patronage networks that help them stay in power. Fourth, China supplies the technology, training, and expertise for repression in some African countries such as Zambia and Zimbabwe. Fifth, Beijing provides scholarships and sponsors trips to China for tens of thousands of African students, scholars, politicians, and media professionals who will likely be exposed to heavy doses of Marxism and Maoism. Whether any Africans are persuaded by the ideology during their stays in China needs further study, but it is an obvious risk. And sixth and finally, Chinese economic practices, such as the use of bribes to win contracts in general favor, or opaque lending and tendering arrangements, fuel corruption and are an obvious challenge to accountable governance. Now, China is not the only influential country in Africa that models illiberal governance. Turkey, which has grown increasingly authoritarian under President Erdogan, has been very active diplomatically, militarily, and economically on the continent. Gulf state monarchies such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, all of which we can assume have little love for democracy, are spreading some of their fabulous wealth to parts of Africa as well. These countries and others allegedly spread cash around during Somalia's last electoral process to influence that result, subverting an American goal of having genuine democracy take root in that country. Finally, Russia, with its mercenaries, arms sales, and economic agreements, is becoming increasingly important on the continent. This should concern the US for a number of reasons, including because we care about democracy. The Gulf states and Turkey do not attack democracy with the same commitment that Beijing does. However, there is still the moral example these countries set, and their willingness to tamper in Somalia's electoral process suggests they are willing to do the same elsewhere. There are a number of steps the US can take to try to strengthen democracy in Africa, but I'll offer 4 brief recommendations. Confidently advocate for American values with the African public and its leaders. Most people yearn for representative government, rule of law, and individual freedom, and the US should unapologetically cheerlead for those values. 2, strengthen civil society in Africa, which is critical to the development and maintenance of a responsive and honest government. 3, prioritize the fight against African government and corruption, which corrodes all efforts to broaden and deepen democratic governance. And finally, deepen cooperation on the continent with pro-democracy allied countries. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. We'll now move to questions, and each member will have 5 minutes. I now recognize myself. I wanted to begin by letting Dr. Fomunyoh, you were getting ready to offer recommendations, and if you would like to continue. And then I also want to ask, after he's finished with his recommendations from our other panelists, if you could provide some examples of which nations do you feel on the continent are the strongest at maintaining their democracies and have not participated in backsliding. Doctor?
Thank you very much, Chairman. And my prepared remarks have got more elaborate recommendations, but the 3 most important recommendations I thought the committee should consider would be first addressed to US policy makers, the need for them to revamp US Africa policy and calibrate such engagement intensely on what I term the democratization wave generation, which is this generation of Africans 35 years or younger who constitute 75% of the 1.4 billion people who live on the African continent. Secondly, that the international community at large should open up global platforms within the United Nations system, including within the United Nations Security Council, and take actions for substantive discussions on Africa and actions that can help put an end to the gross atrocities and human rights violations that we see on the continent in undemocratic regimes that shock the conscience of humanity. And that thirdly, I have a recommendation for Africans themselves, that Africans themselves need to build synergies of national and regional networks or actors to consolidate best practices and enhance peer-to-peer learning and support, and also invest intensely or heavily in empowering women and youth as leaders to safeguard and promote greater and better democratic performance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Biko?
Thank you. In terms of which nations are the strongest, I would point to 5 that come to mind right away. One is Ghana. They are getting ready to hold their 8th election since 1992, and they've had 3 changes of government, 3 changes between the political parties, and so you have a lot of predictability there. Senegal, in fact, in 2016, the Senegalese citizens approved a referendum to reduce the number of years within the terms from 5 to 7. Mauritius, Botswana, and South Africa, those leap to mind right away in terms of strong institutions.
Thank you. Mr. Temin?
Thank you, and I would agree with Dr. Biko's assessment, although I would caveat on Senegal. We are concerned in our observations at Freedom House on their trajectory. 2 prominent opposition politicians were not allowed to compete in the last election, and that was very concerning. And in fact, Senegal has gone from our category of free to our category of partly free. But Dr. Biko is correct. I would add many of the island nations do quite well: Seychelles, Cape Verde, Mauritius, Sao Tome, and Principe. Let me also mention one really good story from this last year, which is Malawi, which had a deeply flawed election process, but there was a lot of resistance from civil society, and the Supreme Court there played a very strong, consistent role respecting rule of law that led to a rerun of the election where the opposition was victorious. That's a real bright spot, and Malawi could join these other countries in doing quite well.
Mr. Meservey?
Yeah, I agree with what my colleagues say. I'm not sure if Namibia was mentioned in their remarks, but I would certainly add that country. And I echo John's comments about Malawi. That was really, frankly, inspiring and surprising, how the outcome of that. So hopefully they can consolidate those victories. And then on the concerning side is Benin. Part of what makes what is happening there so sad is that Benin was actually a previous success story. It was the first country that where an incumbent was defeated at the polls. I'll add that on the worrisome side.
Thank you. Does anybody have an opinion about ECOWAS and what ECOWAS's intervention in Mali, which is a little problematic considering ECOWAS is not consistent? Dr. Biko, are you?
Madam Chair, ECOWAS has had a highly rated reputation in terms of respecting its protocols, because ECOWAS has got on the books the protocol on governance, good governance and democracy that was adopted in 2001. And in a number of countries, ECOWAS has come through in terms of representing the interests of people and their commitment to democratic governance. Unfortunately, in recent months, it's been challenged by the military intervention in Mali, and has tried to model through a compromise solution in finding a retired military officer who is now considered a civilian, and accepting that that civilian could govern Mali while the country goes through a transition of 18 months. So our hope is that Mali will be able to get back on the democratic track with ECOWAS's support, but of course there are concerns with regards to ECOWAS standards in terms of respect for constitutional term limits.
It played a great role in the Gambia, but now we'll see what happens with Mali. You actually are just in time, Mr. Ranking Member, if you'd like to ask questions. Sure. Mr. Burchett?
Chair Lady, if the ranking member would like to go, I'll yield to his wisdom and aid.
He just yielded to you.
Okay, great. Very diplomatic on this committee. I really dig that, Chair Lady. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. It's not in my notes, but sometimes I get popped from some people back home on the internet, and they say, Burchett, what does any of this have to do with the 2nd Congressional District? Well, dadgummit, it has a whole lot to do with it. Freedom is something we should all cherish, and for good folks in Africa that are trying to get it, and it ticks me off when people try to take it from y'all. And I appreciate every one of y'all being here in your testimonies. And y'all got that one for free. That wasn't in my notes, but I heard that some of the officers who took part in the Malay coup d'etat had recently returned from Russia. Additionally, I heard reports that some of the coup supporters were spotted waving Russian flags after President, how do you say his name, Chair Lady? Is it Kita? Is that how you say President Kita was deposed? What, if any, was the role of Russia in this military coup? Any of y'all want to take that? It's fine with me.
Congressman, you're right. We have seen those reports. In fact, we saw images in Bamako demonstrations after the coup, people waving the Russian flag, and also the fact that the Russian ambassador in Bamako was the first foreign ambassador to meet with the coup makers. However, we haven't been able to trace any direct linkages in terms of Russia's role But that's certainly something that needs to be watched very closely.
Yes, sir. I suspect if they're carrying AK-47s and waving Russian flags, that's pretty evident of what the heck's going on. Thank you. How's the resulting political turmoil in Mali affecting the security situation in the Sahel?
Unfortunately, Mali has turned out to be the weak link as countries in the Sahel, ranging from Niger Republic, Burkina Faso, and countries that are part of the G5 Sahel, which is a combination of Chad, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger Republic, fight to curb the expansion of violent extremists in the Sahel. As we all know, northern Mali has been in turmoil since 2012. And so to have the government in Bamako be undermined further aggravates what is already predating risk for the country that could be further fragilized by violent extremism. It is important that the government of Mali regain its feet and regain its commitment to democratic government and a professional military that can help working with the partners, for example, the French with the Operations Barkhane and other United Nations peacekeeping forces to curb this spread. Because if Mali falls, if any one of the countries in the Sahel falls, then the coastal countries along the West African coast are going to be immediately hit. And that would mean that would be very catastrophic for the rest of the continent.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Meservey, you published a report recently where you documented that Chinese companies have built around 190 African government buildings, including over 20 houses of African heads of state. Combine that with the reports that Huawei technology is used during construction, and we are looking at the Chinese having ample opportunities for spying and intelligence gathering operations. What more should we be doing to highlight the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to undermine democratic governance and support for authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think that one of the best things we can do, and it's a longer term solution, but I also think it is the most effective chance we have here, is to buttress civil society organizations in Africa. A number of them have actually been effective in shining light on some Chinese activity going on. So they've been able to expose deals that were not to the benefit of the country. They were able to stop projects that were going to be environmentally disastrous. So they have had a surprising amount of success. And I think the U.S. should double down on its support of those sorts of organizations. That includes journalists. The Chinese government has made a very concerted effort to co-opt African journalists all across the continent. So I think the U.S. needs to launch sort of a counter movement, if you will, where we support independent, ferocious journalism on the continent. So I always come back to civil society. I think that's a critical part of what we need to be doing on the continent.
Okay. Chair Lady, thank you. I've gone over my time. Thank you for your courtesy. I have to go to the Small Business Committee. I apologize. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for
You're
being
welcome.
here.
Thank you.
Let me go to Representative Phillips.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, and greetings and gratitude to all of our witnesses today in this important hearing. Strengthening democratic institutions.
Do you get closer to your laptop? There you go.
Okay. Is that a little better?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Strengthening democratic institutions and exposing democratic backsliding is terribly important work and a distinct priority of mine in Congress. The United States is not perfect. We all see what's happening in our very own country right now. But what is important is that we are constantly working to improve, to strengthen, and to encourage free and fair elections all around the world, including in our own country, and to use our voices powerfully, but also peacefully. I'd like to start to talk about, my question will be first about Ethiopia. While Prime Minister Abiy advanced a vision of national unity early in his term by releasing political prisoners and unbanning certain political parties and promising free and fair elections. It has become very clear that there's a lot more work to be done relative to his reform agenda. So I've heard a lot of concerns from my constituents in Minnesota regarding restrictions on civil liberties, violence perpetrated against civilians by state and non-state actors, arrests of human rights activists in the Somali region of Ethiopia, and detention of political opposition leaders. So my first question is for you, Mr. Temin. What can Abiy's government do to mitigate ethnic incitement into religious conflict and hate speech without restricting civil liberties? And going forward, how can the government more effectively respond to ethnic and religious tensions in the country?
Thank you for the question and from raising some very concerning issues in Ethiopia. There are no easy answer to these questions. One of the most important steps is that the Abiy government really seek to consult with the political opposition and politicians across the spectrum, and they haven't been very good at doing that so far. The decision they made to postpone elections was probably the right one given COVID and logistical challenges, but they did that in a vacuum without consultation, and that's led to a lot of the grievance that we're seeing now. Elections are now supposed to happen in 2021, so the government needs to start now a real process of consultation with the entire political spectrum to talk about the road between here and those elections and how those elections can be as free, fair, and transparent as possible. Those elections really can be transformative. But the government simply has to stop reaching for these tools of past repression that we really thought were relegated to history. And they need to be called out on that, frankly. The U.S. and the rest of the world should not be in the business of celebrating Prime Minister Abiy. That probably happened a little bit too much, a little bit too quickly, even given some of the remarkable early steps. But we need to be in the business of strengthening Ethiopian institutions and Ethiopian civil society and those who are investigating and highlighting the abuses that are going on. The ethnic violence is substantial, and it is hard to contain. I will note that there are voices that are fanning this ethnic animosity across the spectrum, many of them in Ethiopia. Some of them are outside of Ethiopia, too. And we do need to keep an eye on those voices, including in the diaspora, who do sometimes fan the flames of ethnic tension.
No, thank you, sir. And we also have elections coming up in Cote d'Ivoire on October 31st, I believe. Of course, it's clear that the country is at risk as well for large-scale violence against civilians. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, early warning signs of mass atrocity are already visible and certainly warrant attention. I've just introduced House Resolution 1150, which highlights this important issue and urges the government of Cote d'Ivoire, opposition leaders, and all citizens to respect the democratic principles, refrain from violence, and hold free and fair and transparent elections this October. Dr. Biko, regarding Cote d'Ivoire, what can the United States and our embassy in particular do to support transparent and peaceful elections in October? And for that matter, in Ethiopia and Somalia, what can be done to create conditions for those same free and fair elections next year in 2021? Dr. Biko?
Yes. Thank you for that, that question. Yes, the upcoming elections in Cote d'Ivoire are quite worrisome because the violence has already started. We've seen that with opposition forces or opposition supporters being attacked. The important way to support civil society is to support efforts that help civil society track what the state is doing, how to substantiate results, to make sure that there is inclusion in voter registration. Those are things that kind of fuel the violence, although the underlying reason for the violence is the fact that the incumbent is seeking to run for for his third term. And so that is the real issue that is fueling a lot of this violence.
Thank you.
And adhering to term limits is one way that will stop.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I did just leave a hearing on China. As I mentioned before, I'm a ranking member on the China Commission. And the discussion was on the 70 years of Tibetan oppression by the Chinese government, made much more worse, more recently by Xi Jinping, as he has done to the Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. And I'm concerned, and I've been concerned, and as the chairwoman knows, I've chaired a number of hearings when I was chairman of this subcommittee on China's malign influence on Africa, its ability to buy votes, particularly at the UN, its ability to build a soccer stadium or do something else in order to gain benefits that are very tangible. There's no Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so when it comes to trade, bribes are help facilitate the deal. But the biggest concern I think most of us are having, I have as well, is China's bad governance model. And I'm wondering if you might speak, any of you who would like, about this. You know, in 2019, the African leaders pledged to use the Belt and Road to build a Sino-Africa community of common destiny. A China-Africa Institute was established to develop new models in mutual learning and to facilitate policy synergy and alignment in bringing this about. Kenya's Vision 2030, Rwanda's Vision 2050, Uganda's Vision 2040, and South Africa's National Development Plan 2030 are examples of this strategic African blueprints that incorporate elements of the Chinese government's model and envision ongoing Chinese inputs as key catalysts. And I'm wondering if you would speak to this. We know that, you know, in Zimbabwe, the Chinese were providing Mugabe with all kinds of help. There's very high-profile Bashir found, and Khartoum had found that, you know, China was a very willing assister and enabler of their terrible deeds for all those years. But now we have, I think, this all-out effort to, you know, sanction the kind of governance that China does to its own people each and every day, and that is cruel repression of the Han Chinese, the Tibetans, the people of faith, the Falun Gong, and the Muslim Uyghurs and others. So could you speak to that? I mean, how do we undo this malign influence that I think is in ascendancy throughout the world, not just in Africa, as China? I mean, look at the impact they're having at the UN Human Rights Council. They are barely held to account for anything that they do, including this ongoing genocide against the Muslims in Xinjiang. So your thoughts on that? Because you know, there are always people in governments who want to do the right thing, and that's certainly, you know, with exclamation points, what we know so many people in Africa want to do. But then you get these affiliations with people who say, you know, oppression works, secret police works, jailing dissidents works, and that's the Chinese model. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you for the question. Let me just make a brief point, which is that in democracies, Chinese misbehavior is more likely to be scrutinized. And that is all the more reason for the entire topic of the conversation today, which is American investment in democracy promotion and advancing democracy in Africa. In democracies, civil society organizations are more likely to dig into what China is doing. In democracies, the government is probably more willing to dig into that as well. And to reiterate an important point that Josh made earlier, building that capacity to better scrutinize Chinese activity is really important. And that's both within civil society across Africa and within African governments as well, to fully understand the deals that they are signing up for, the long-term consequences of those deals. Josh also made a really important point, which I'll reiterate, on investigative journalism. You know, I think there is no better bang for the buck than investments in investigative journalism and supporting those brave journalists across the continent to really dig into Chinese activity.
Thank you very much. Representative Omar?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for this important
committee hearing and grateful to our witnesses. I want to start with Dr. Fomunyoh. In your testimony, you discussed the massacres committed in the Anglophone region of Cameroon. Did the United States provide training, funding, or arms to the Cameroonian security forces who committed those massacres?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, for your question. That has been an issue of concern because prior to the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon in 2016, Cameroon was a partner with the United States and a number of other countries in fighting Boko Haram in the extreme north of the country, around the Lake Chad Basin countries, in collaboration with Nigeria, Chad, and Niger Republic. But what we've seen in recent years, especially in the last 2 years, has been that some of the resources that were initially donated to the government of Cameroon to help the fight against Boko Haram in the extreme northern part of the country have moved, both in terms of material and personnel, into the Anglophone regions of the country, where there's an ongoing armed conflict. And that's extremely worrying because we're beginning to see some of the tactics and gross violations of human rights in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon that had been recorded in incidents happening in the extreme north of the country, and that's something to be watchful about. I should just remark briefly that the United States had been forced, the State Department had been forced to reduce some of its assistance, military assistance to Cameroon, as a recognition that some of the units that may have been trained to fight Boko Haram in the extreme north had been involved in human rights violations as well.
All right. So I assume that would be sort of a yes. And so did the Millennium military officers who led the recent coup, Assimi Gota, receive U.S. military training? And if you can just say yes or no, because I have a few more questions and we have limited time.
Well, I do not have specific information on that point, but there have been reports of capacity building for Malian military as it's been fighting the violent extremists in the northern and middle part of the country, and that some of those soldiers or units may have trained alongside U.S. forces in the Sahel.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I would like to introduce into the record an article from the Washington Post about the U.S. military training that Colonel Gota received.
Yes, thank you.
The article includes a quote I will read here. Helping the nation's troops fight rapidly spreading extremism is critical for regional stability, U.S. military officials said. That quote stood out to me because last year we cut off security aid to Cameroon and we suspended security aid to Mali this year. Yet U.S. military officials are quoted in this article saying that our counterterrorism policy is critical for regional stability. And this trend of supporting militarized brutality in the name of counterterrorism in the continent is widespread in the continent. I've mentioned Cameroon and Mali, but I could easily mention Somalia, Mozambique, Kenya, or a number of other countries in the continent. Dr. Fomunyoh, you were quite right to say that violent extremism is a threat to democracy in Africa. But I would also like to ask, is it time we start wondering if our militarized counterterrorism strategy is also a threat to democracy in Africa?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. That's a very excellent point, and that's a point that NDI and our sister organization, IRI, the International Republican Institute, that we continue to make to our partners, that whether it's our funders or the African countries in which we work, that counterterrorism has to be a holistic approach that involves not just a militaristic technical assistance or building the capacity of the military, but also working with civilian institutions, parliaments to exercise oversight, civil society to engage in healthy relations with the executive and legislative branches of government. And I would cite as an example a country that you know well, Congresswoman, in terms of Niger, that is really in the middle of a very difficult neighborhood, but that is managing very well to bring to the table all of the levers, the instruments of governance that range all the way from the military to legislators and civil society in its efforts against counterterrorism. And fortunately for Niger Republic, it seems to be holding its own and doing relatively well in a very difficult neighborhood. So your point is well taken.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Representative Houlihan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you all for being here today. I really genuinely would love an answer to this question, a legitimate answer, because it's very concerning to me. Sure. And I'll start with some data that we prepared before last evening's debate, and then a conversation about our debate here in our nation last night, and then a genuine question that I'd love to hear from you all on. The Freedom House's global freedom score for the U.S. is 86 out of 100, so I think that's about a B, and is number 52 on the Freedom House rank of free countries. Finland, Norway, and Sweden fill the top 3 spots, each with scores of 100. Last evening in our own debate here in this country, our president, our commander-in-chief, would not denounce white supremacists, and he would not commit to a peaceful transition of power. How does all of this play into how we are seen and respected as leaders and beacons in democracy? I'm genuinely interested in what has happened over the last several years in terms of our standing and our credibility in this particular area, particularly in Africa. Mr. Temin, is it? Perhaps we could start with you.
Sure, and thank you for the question. It hurts our standing, and it hurts our ability to support the American values of democracy that we seek to enhance around the world. I think many of us who have watched Africa for some time and have been outspoken in our critique of anti-democratic moves in countries on the continent are seeing some of those things come to pass in our own country and are deeply concerned by that. I would also say, though, that there are a lot of lessons from around the world in how to respond when these threats happen. And we would do well to listen to people who have pushed back against these kinds of threats to democracy and ask ourselves if some of their experience and some of their lessons applies to what's happening here. Because we have a lot to learn in how to respond to these things as we also seek to help the rest of the world learn on democracy promotion.
And what specific lessons learned might we benefit from other nations that have struggled with this?
Mm-hmm. We have seen in other countries the vital role of journalists in holding government to account, in exposing corruption and other misdeeds. We have seen the vital role of civil society in staying strong and being a voice for people who feel like they are not represented by the government, if not targeted by the government. We have seen the vital role of human rights defenders who put their lives on the line in many places in defense of the values that they hold dear. There's nothing unique about Africa or any other part of the world in what makes these segments of society so important, and I would think they apply to the U.S. as well.
I would love to hear from the other members of the panel as well, if you have something to add. Doctor?
I think
Thank you.
one message is that democratic progress does not have an endpoint. It is a constant struggle, and it also requires all stakeholders to play their role, to be vigilant, to kind of move the process along. And we don't get to a place where we say, this is the end and we can rest on our laurels.
No, I think that's very, very fair. It's very precious, and that we definitely need to protect it. Doctor, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add to what is being said by my co-panelist, that Africans, the world has become a global village, and Africans themselves are also following very closely what happens with other democracies, established democracies around the globe. And that back in May, when we had the George Floyd murder in Minnesota, that in a number of African countries, people were actually astonished that incidents like those could occur in the United States. But what we saw also was a number of US embassies on the African continent issuing statements to clarify for the African people what had actually transpired. And I think the hope for African Democrats as they look to developments around the world is to see confirmation that in democracies, institutions really matter, and that democracies have a propensity to self-correct, that ultimately when things go wrong and institutions work and people have their voices heard and people organize themselves to have a seat at the table, that ultimately their voices would count and democracies will self-correct.
I appreciate that, a very hopeful way to end, and I yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. You know, it's my understanding that all 50-plus nations on the continent registered a protest at the United Nations over police brutality in the United States as an act of solidarity. Representative Sherman, without objection, we are glad to welcome you here to participate in the subcommittee meeting. Are you ready with questions?
I am indeed.
Take it away.
And Chairwoman Bass, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this subcommittee. And I want to build on some of the comments you've made, because I've been somewhat embarrassed in talking to leaders not only from Africa, but around the world, because we are working for democracy. We're sometimes critical of democratic institutions or the lack thereof in other countries. And it's somewhat embarrassing to have a president who says that he might not accept the outcome of an election. I've seen that happen in Africa. Perhaps one of our witnesses can comment on how a country, and give us an example or two of how countries have been affected when there's been an election, the incumbent has been turned out of office, and the incumbent doesn't want to go. I'll direct it at Dr. Bekoe.
Well, the country that comes to mind is Gambia. The incumbent did not want to leave office, and it required the intervention of the regional economic community to mediate his exit.
Well, I hope we don't have to adopt the Gambia model here in the United States. We have much to learn from countries around the world, but hopefully we won't need that learning. And we're in a ideological contest with China and others who are trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, and their effort is to discredit democracy. Africa is one place where we say that democracy is important, and China says the opposite and says that democracy doesn't work. And I think that what I saw last night on my television screen did not help our argument. Dr. Fomunyoh, we spend money promoting democratic institutions, government accountability. Can you give us examples of where that efforts have been successful, where a country has moved substantially toward democracy and the rule of law, and what would be the impact of Trump's proposed 37% decrease in that funding?
Thank you very much, Congressman. First, if I could just add to my co-panelist, Dr. Bekoe, on the examples where elections have helped to strengthen democracies and where they've been under threat. Cote d'Ivoire is another example to keep in mind, and to know that in 2010, because of disagreement over the outcome of the presidential elections, the country converted into a crisis that left 3,000 Ivorians dead. It's taken 10 years for Cote d'Ivoire to recover from that crisis. Our hope is that going into the 2020 elections, Ivorians will make efforts to not have to repeat the mistakes of the past. On the other hand, in Africa's largest democracy, which is Nigeria, with over 200 million inhabitants. We went through an experience in 2015 that was very heartening in the sense that the incumbent president, Goodluck Jonathan, lost the elections, and even before the Independent Election Commission could make the call on the elections, he picked up his phone and called his opposition, the current president, Muhammadu Buhari. And that brought tensions down considerably in Nigeria. And that phone call that went from President Goodluck Jonathan to President Buhari has helped stabilize Nigeria's democracy up until this point. So there's some happy stories to report. And in a country such as Nigeria, with support from USAID, the International Republican Institute, NDI, SAIB, and Solidarity Center have conducted programs in the past 2 decades that have allowed Nigeria to make the transition from being ruled by the military up until 1999 to now a functioning democracy for the first time in Nigerian history, that Nigeria has been governed by civilian democratic governments for over 20 years.
I thank you. I'm going to try to, can I squeeze in one more question? And thank you for reminding us how important it is that after all the ballots are counted, that whoever is the loser in our election acknowledges that and concedes. The one more question is for Mr. Temin. The chairwoman and I and others have come to know Bobby Wine. We know he's been severely beaten on various occasions. How would you classify the situation in Uganda leading up to the February presidential election?
Very concerning and not getting as much attention as it probably should. Uganda is talking about what they are calling scientific elections in response to COVID, which means no physical campaigning for the most part, doing a lot of it virtually online. I think that this gives significant advantage to the ruling party, and it's not clear that the ruling party is willing to stick to all those rules, but they will probably be more strictly enforced with the opposition, I am guessing. You know, President Museveni has been in power a long time. I do not see much indication of plans for what comes next or for transition, and in any country that is worrisome because I think we've seen in a number of instances, the longer some leaders stay in office and the less planning there is for what comes next, the rockier that transition can be. And I don't know if that transition comes with the next election or later. But I think Uganda is of concern. It is concerning because it has a very young population, one of the youngest on the continent, and I think there is a good deal of frustration amongst that youthful element of the population. So it is one to watch for sure.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. And I believe Representative Omar had some additional questions. I'll give Representative Omar another 5 minutes. And then when we come back, before we conclude, Mr. Temin, you made reference, or actually Representative Houlihan made reference to the score of the United States on Freedom House, and I wanted you to address that after Representative Omar's questions. Representative Omar, are you there? Why don't you go ahead and address that, and we'll see if we can get Representative Omar back on WebEx.
Sure. What I can say about that is Freedom in the World, which we do every year, rates every country in the world. That includes the United States. The United States score was decreasing before this administration. We have seen a slow slippage of democracy in America for some time, based on our scores. That decrease has accelerated under this administration.
But what is it? What, you know, give me the specifics.
I don't have the data in front of me. I'm sure we can follow up on that.
Well, you generally know how you do the scoring.
I do.
So,
I'm deeply involved when we do the Africa scoring, less so with the U.S. scoring. You know, I think part of it has to do with freedom for journalists. I believe there's been some concern there. Part of it has to do with corruption and some of the indications that we've seen of corrupt activity within government. I'll leave it there. We are happy to go dig into that and provide you more detail. And I'm sure that when we look at the scores again later this year, there will be a robust conversation on the United States.
Well, do you, when you consider, I mean, I don't know about other countries, but when you consider the United States, do you consider racial issues, such as police brutality or systemic racism, or how do you?
Freedom in the World measures the freedoms that citizens feel across the board in any country. We divide those freedoms into political rights and civil liberties, and within each one of those two categories, there's a number of indicators and sub-indicators. Certainly, the freedoms that all people in society and all segments of society are absolutely considered as we do those scores. And that would include freedom from police brutality and excessive force used by security forces. When we are digging...
Incarceration rates, right to vote.
Again, I don't have all the indicators and the sub-indicators in front of me, but absolutely, the right to vote is a fundamental freedom that is definitely part of our indicators. As is the ability to do so freely and to do so without harassment. And security force brutality certainly comes into our considerations in every country. I have been involved in those conversations in the Africa context, and there's no reason that America would be any different.
Well, thank you. I will look forward to understanding that. And I'm sure incarceration rates have to be a part of that as well, right? I mean, the essence of freedom.
We will follow up with you, but I agree with you that that is absolutely a core component of freedom. And I mean, the answer is yes. You know, when we have seen political opponents and others jailed in African countries and elsewhere, that factors into our scores. And again, that applies globally, it applies to the United States.
Thank you. Okay. It looks like Representative Omar will not be with us, so let me just use this opportunity to thank our witnesses, appreciate your patience, especially with our challenge of how we even conduct hearings in a COVID environment. So thank you very much, and with this, our hearing is adjourned.